It's a really weird thing to walk on stage and see your face that big. It's just not right. Don't know about you, but I had quite a big lunch. I also had Coke, and I don't really drink fizzy drinks that much, so I'm feeling a bit gassy. It's not a great start to the talk, I'll be honest. You've managed to take away all my intro. So I don't have much energy because I ate so much food, but I thought we'll do pink, and that might kind of invigorate you a little bit after lunch. And this thing moves. It's a bit weird. Anyone get the Madonna reference? No?
It's the point of tits, isn't it? Yeah.
You said you weren't going to mention that, Dave. I'm now really self-conscious. So I am now a design advocate for zeroheight, which it took me a little while to work out what it is, but it's this with blog posts and just speaking to people. And I love hearing about people's design system journeys. Everyone's got a different story, even though we're all solving very similar problems. So what I really want to go into is some of the macro and micro of design systems, because we've heard some awesome stuff right from the morning with Amy kicking ass for the first talk, really thinking about all the higher level stuff, if you like, really important stuff that we don't consider. I wanted to share a video, if I can learn how to click on the video. Bear with me. You can't hear the sound, and that's okay. So, I grew up in Huddersfield. The accent gives it away in no way whatsoever. But as part of a school trip, we went to Bradford to what was called the Film and Photography Museum at the time. And this video stayed with me, because they had one of the first IMAX screens in the country at that point. And they had these kind of short experimental films. And so this Powers of 10, from the office of Charles and Ray Eames, stayed with me for a long time. And so I've kind of used it in lots of ways to talk about how you can go in and out of detail, how you can think about all these things running concurrently. And so it starts off with this couple just laying on having a picnic, as you do, and zooms right out to show just how small we are. This was 1977, and it blew my mind that even as a child, they didn't have Google Maps or Google Earth to do this. How on earth did they make this work? Yeah, so there's a QR code if you want to watch it in your own time. It's 9 minutes long, so I could just let this run and just do a shorter talk, to be honest. So it goes out to show the whole planet. It goes out to show what an insignificant little dot we are, which again, keeping with the real upper theme, feels good. Oh, look, there we are. Somewhere on one of those arms. So then we went back to the guys having a picnic. And this time we went inside the dude's hand, which was a bit creepy, to be honest. I'm not really sure how accurate it was either. And you get down to DNA, and you're like fairly sure that's not what I look like inside my hand. But it just made me think, like, that scale is just ridiculous. There was as much inside our hand as the universe? What? So, yeah, there is a reason I'm showing you this. Some of it is starting off with the top level of the macro of what we do, being the various systems that we have. And a chance to show you some real history. The new Prime Minister Tony Blair on Politics 97, the BBC. The little history lesson is useful because in these times, with a relatively new medium, every layout had to be made discreetly. We didn't have CSS as such, and so everything had to be a copy, maybe server-generated stuff. It was just labor-intensive, a lot of duplication. And then we think about layouts we have today, and we go, super easy. Yeah, of course we can knock that together in like half an hour. Not that we did. And then we can reskin it and have something that's really quite similar, but looks very different. So things moved on. So as we had tech changing around us, we also had language changing. And so instead of thinking about pages and layouts, we started to think more about reusability and how do we describe this stuff. And so language is quite an emergent thing. It only really becomes a thing when people use it. So we started to have CSS patterns. We started to realize that there's some kind of reusability we can get. So we started talking about kind of classes, reusability, sharing stuff, all good things. But that was just the CSS bit. And now we can look at this and quite easily go, here's a bunch of stuff which should probably be a reusable thing. And we can start to very quickly highlight, well, that's probably a pattern because we use it there. That seems like a component that we might use in various places. And you can quite quickly start breaking down in your head. It's not a whole composition. It's built of lots of other patterns. So one of the things that came with it, this evolution of technology, is being really cohesive with what we mean by componentization. Because we couldn't really do it before. We were faking it, going, oh yeah, it's a component. It's not though, is it? You got a bit of CSS over there, you got a bit of Java making some HTML and blah, blah, blah. It's a mess. Not that I'm a huge fan of front-end frameworks, but one thing they did was mesh everything together and go, that I hold in my hand is a component. All the parts are together, I have mastered this. Or something. It might just be me, I'm fine with that. And so that's a significant change, because now instead of saying components when we're just talking about CSS or something like that, we're now binding everything together and saying a component is the styles, its accessibility, its markup, its data, it's all of these things with states and matter reloading. It's insane. And then we go the opposite way, and we dive down into the details. See, it's kind of relating to the video. And so we get all these patterns, and we think, this is a reusable thing. So how do we break things down in a usable way? And sometimes people put a slide that's a little bit too literal in their deck. Sometimes. But you tear it all apart and you think, yeah, but that typography in that is the same as that. That color on that rounded corner is the same as that. That button probably is the same as that. And it's trying to look at how far do you go with breaking stuff down? How similar are things? Which meant there's an opportunity to look even closer. And that means that at this really small level, you start to think, yeah, I'm having an existential crisis about a button. Is it the same as that button? Is it doing the same job? But a button should be a button, but this is a link that looks like a button. And we start getting ourselves tied up with all these conversations and losing our shit and going, I spent the day on that. It's a button and I haven't changed it, but I have stroked my chin a lot. So we question a lot about, we have a lot of things. We've done some breaking down. And that's really cool. And then we just look around and go, well, I've just made a mess. I've broken these layouts down into all these little things. We've had a bit of angst, we've had a bit of communication, and we've discovered the true meaning behind everything. And we feel pretty smug about that, because we've got lots of things. It's not good, though, is it? Things aren't good on their own. They need context. And so we lay out all our things, all our Lego bricks, and we look at how do we then make stuff. Because they're quite abstract when you see them all laid out. It is like you've just tipped Lego all over the floor and gone, I've got a system, make your stuff. It's going to be fine. And so with emergent language, second reference to Brad Frost, I think? Yeah? Cool. Just let him know, because I need to check. Whew. My job's done. But now, even if you don't necessarily use atomic design, you probably heard the term. And so even if you've not read his book, which you should, with these terms, even if you don't use atoms, molecules, organisms, and the things, it's fine. There's now a structure to talk about how we grade, how complex, or how these things are built of other things. So that's emergent language in a way, because we've now started to talk about atomic design, responsive design, and these things like, of course, everyone knows these things. Thoughtful pause and a drink of water. Yeah, I shouldn't have had a Coke, to be honest. It's a bad choice. I can't help it. So then we get into anatomy. And so obviously we immediately think about slicing up people, because, no? All right. Well, you think about the people that used to dig up corpses for the doctors, no? Shit. But then you also think about redlining, or I do, because I wrote the talk. And this is like a meta level of design where you scroll on and annotate things, which has been used in architecture and all sorts for a very long time. Given that meta level of why are these things, how are we describing these things, how do we know the measures of stuff? So I'm going to run with that a little bit by saying, this humble button in the corner, if I zoom in, it has properties. And that's pretty boring to look at, I've got to be honest. I thought it was going to be more impressive. But stay with it. If you break it down, we get stuff like this. We lay out our stuff. And we realize we've got a couple of colors going on. There's some kind of a radius. There are some spacing units. And there's a whole bunch of typography stuff we've not even really thought about. It's just the word label. That's not all that useful, really. But then if you change the naming and start thinking about not what are they now, but what do they represent, you start to get to more semantic naming, which is another existential crisis for another time, I've got to be honest. I've lost far too much of my life on that. But then you start to think more about, it doesn't matter what these values are today, it's more about what they represent. So lots more beard-stroking moments, I think. Then you get to design tokens, which had to be mentioned at some point. And so we just have some values stored in some variable names. And now I'm even more smug. I've broken down the things even smaller and have names for everything. Yeah, I've read all the blog posts. I know what I'm doing. But this is a really interesting point in the fact that where things used to be handed over, like we've designed the perfect thing, and then the developers are going to screw it up. Or the developers might go, the designers, what were they thinking? Maybe. I haven't thought that at all. But we get to this, which is an actual token, which looks like crap to most people, but this is about as atomic as you can get if you're really going down those levels. This is the DNA. Actually, my colleague Jules wrote something about design tokens being the DNA of your design system. Maybe I'll rip that off. So what we've got here is a simple little bit of JSON. If you're not familiar, it's a JavaScript object. It's really portable. Most code can probably read this. And that tells us that we've got a token. It gives it some sense of hierarchy and a brief description of what it currently is. You can't get much smaller than that. But then you think about, we've gone too low now, haven't we? It's kind of pointless. So then we think about today, as an example, you might use Figma tokens, you might not. But there's a way of bringing it into the UI of design tools. And this is only going to improve because there is a standardization process around design tokens themselves. So we can get that real interoperability and try and get a sense of, I made it in Figma, I took it to code, I put it in Sketch, I moved it back to Figma again because I got confused and forgot what we were using. But it's all fine because it's JSON and it's interchangeable. And I got confused. And so then we have states and variants of buttons. And sorry, Rob, I just rubbed these. But it's the same button. And so what we're now seeing is this blur between how maybe developers thought of a component and how designers now are. So it's the same button, we're just changing some properties. So in design terms, we used to have to make copies and just go duplicate, change some colors or whatever. But the concept of this being a reusable component is relatively new. That's pretty cool. So now we get to themes. I hope this bit works. So the way I think about themes is it's an application of brand. Just being really, really superficial with it. And that doesn't imply a hell of a lot. A theme could be as simple as Christmas mode with snow. If you wanted, you could do that. It could be dark mode if that's how you thought of a theme, that's fine. It could be as extreme as a complete change of your design system, because all of these granular properties could be in a theme. So if we take that same button and go, this different application of brand, this different theme, needs to have green buttons that are slightly smaller. We've got a few changes, but it looks completely different. Oh yeah, I could have made it more different, but yeah, you get the point. So the question is, as your component, how does it know which theme to use, and how should it express itself? It's the same button in code, in design. So then we could, if we wanted to use tokens again, have a level of component-level tokens, which say, specific to this kind of component, I want to describe the tokenizable properties. That doesn't have to be everything. It depends what you want to change between themes. You can start with very little and add a few more properties as things emerge. Right now, there's no drop shadow on this. Maybe in future, that needs to be something that is a property of this component. That's fine, we can add it. And now if we have these component-level tokens, how do we start to reconcile these different values? And so we think about theming, and that's really about relationships between tokens. So what I've got here is not going to make a hell of a lot of sense. I'm not trying to show you how to use tokens in depth. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a couple of themes, you can make relationships with your core token set and swap them out, and you get a completely different look and feel. So still at this really, really basic, really, really granular, tiniest little bit of sand, the knock-on effects can be really profound. So we've got some component tokens. We've got a bunch of tokens used for the current theme and the new theme, and you can see how there are some differences. So you could have a shared token set, in which case you have a bucket full of tokens, and you go, I want to make some relationships between the theme, the component tokens, and what we have in our big bucket full of tokens. This is how I describe the properties of our button. And it gets a bit messy, because then you've got this interdependency of different themes on the same values, and that doesn't feel very good. So you separate them into buckets. And then you start to get a sense of these tokens are what we need for the whole system, but for this button, this is the relationship. Those same relationships will be different for the next theme. So you've got consistency in the component tokens, maintaining those relationships. So it's just about changing relationships between tokens. This gives you powerful theming. This could have been a whole talk on its own, but I wanted to think about how things relate. And one really good post that you should definitely read if you want real detail about naming and relationships is Nathan Curtis. Was that the second or third reference we got to him today? If you've not read it, give it a read. He goes into a lot of detail. QR codes work. Who said they didn't? So what he doesn't sort of say this is the only way to do it, but walks through a number of ways that people have named their tokens, how they might relate, and some strategies you might want to use, which is really handy. So implicitly, we've got colors that relate. We've got spacing that relates. We may have something called core tokens, where you identify these are all the things that we have, and then we have our semantic layer, which is a little bit less bound to what the current value is. And we're going back up again. We've got our component-level tokens, so we can see the relationship between the current theme. So a color primary is the background of the button. We can then start to see how all these relationships make the thing. Then we get to see how our little button is part of a bigger component. Oh, do you see, like I'm trying to do the video? And then that gets used in a thing. And we see how we've got this little pattern of an input and a button, which probably has a lot of properties that we can't see to make it accessible, to make sure it works as part of a sequence. But then we see it in context, which would be one of many use cases. And then we see that as part of a whole layout. And we start to see how all these things build up and interrelate. So in our minds, we can jump down, right down to, we have a token, which describes a very specific thing, which probably has a very specific job. But as part of all of these layers, we get entire layouts that we can theme at will, and we can get power hungry and cackle. And then we have a design system. We then have the people around it. There's loads of different models of the way that this can work, but these are things that we can design with intent. We can try and think about the design of the people systems as much as the system itself. And we go out again and see that with each group, there are a whole bunch of different qualities, of different people, different skill sets. And ultimately, outside of the organization, there may be some external people wanting to use your design system or look at it or contribute to it in some way, depending on your structure. So in some ways, we've gone super into the detail and come right back out. And then we can even take a sidestep and think about, can we map out our workflows and our structure in some way? What it all comes down to for me, though, is it's just people and objects. I don't think I can get much more reductionist than that. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about tokens or components or anything else. Like, this is all it comes down to. But they're objects we can't see. We're not all making VW campers. Although maybe some of us might be converted. So at every single level, lots of these things are true. It's about how we talk to each other and work together to define those little tiny details. What is this token? What should we call it? What does it represent? As much as who should we be talking to? Who should we be working with? The same principles sort of apply. So really going back to that video, what stayed with me was that whole thing of being able to, in your mind, somehow be able to zoom into the details and give a shit about what does this token represent at the right time, and then zoom right out to go, is this a socialist or capitalist pattern? Like, these things are both important in different contexts. It's not one or the other. And so it's trying to choose how deep we want to go, how high level we want to go. Where do we feel we can add value, and recognize that these are all important to different people at different times. So really, although I should have called the talk something else, it's really about relationships, all of it. It's relationships between things like tokens and components. It's relationships between the people that make the system and make the system a success. So it doesn't matter whether it's relationships between things or between people. They can all be done with intent and care. So it all matters, but in really different ways with similar properties. That doesn't work, does it? Going back to the theme, though, there's another way of building bridges. If someone is right in the detail, that's fine. Encourage them to see there's other layers and participate if they feel they want to or can in other levels of conversation, and be happy and comfortable moving between those layers of complexity. And that's all I've got for you. Thank you.